So friends, the question for the day is, has Mark Meadows flipped on Donald Trump? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, given some new reporting by the Washington Post about Mark Meadows, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, I have one burning question that I would love to know the answer to, but I don't. Will Mark Meadows be a star prosecution witness against Donald Trump at trial, or will Mark Meadows be a marquee co-defendant with Donald Trump when the January 6th indictment drops? Because the more reporting I see, the more it feels like those are the only two options for Mark Meadows. Let's take on the Washington Post reporting, and we're going to have to do something of a deep dive into this article. Headline: before January 6th, Mark Meadows joked about Trump's election claims. Because, if you can't have a little fun with insurrection. That article begins, Mark Meadows joked about the baseless claims that large numbers of votes were fraudulently cast in the names of dead people in the days before the then White House Chief of Staff participated in a phone call in which President Donald Trump alleged there were close to 5,000 dead voters in Georgia, and urged Brad Raffensperger, Georgia's Secretary of State, to overturn the 2020 election there. In a text message that has been scrutinized by federal prosecutors, Meadows wrote to a White House lawyer that his son, Atlanta area attorney Blake Meadows, had been probing possible fraud and had only found a handful of possible votes cast in dead voters' names, far short of what Trump was alleging. The lawyer teasingly responded that perhaps Meadows' son could locate the thousands of votes Trump would need to win the election. The text was described by multiple people familiar with the exchange. The jocular text message is one of many exchanges from the time in which Trump aides and other Republican officials expressed deep skepticism or even openly mocked the election claims being made publicly by Trump, according to people familiar with the investigation, who spoke on the condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the criminal investigation. Special Counsel Jack Smith, who is leading a Justice Department investigation of Trump's activities in the weeks leading up to the January 6th, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, has focused on exploring whether Trump and his closest advisors understood that claims of fraud in the election were baseless, even as they pressed state officials and others to overturn Biden's victory and convinced Trump's millions of supporters that the election had been stolen, people familiar with the probe have said. The text message is a small part of a broader portrait of Meadows that Smith appears to be assembling as he weighs the actions of not just Trump, but a number of his closest advisors, including Meadows. People close to Meadows have said that he was privately sympathetic to those Trump advisors who were skeptical of the fraud claims, yet Meadows also played both sides, often appearing to indulge Trump's desire to use those false allegations to try to remain in office, people who witnessed his behavior have said. Since Trump said he was named a target of Smith's investigation earlier this week, his allies have been feverishly speculating about the degree of Meadows' cooperation with the Smith probe and whether he has provided testimony that Smith will use to build a case against Trump or others. The article then notes that the Mark Meadows text was presented as evidence to the grand jury. The article continues, Days after Meadows sent the text, he organized the Raffensperger call on January 2nd, in which Trump pressed to find the votes in the state necessary to overturn Biden's victory. A recording of the call shows that Meadows did not interject or challenge Trump's claims about votes cast in the name of dead people. Instead, when Raffensperger countered that state investigators had found just 2 such votes, he responded, "That may be what your investigation shows, but I can promise you there are more than that." Meadows expended particular energy after the 2020 vote on Georgia, a traditionally Republican-leaning state that Biden won by nearly 12,000 votes, former White House officials and campaign aides said. Meadows lobbied other officials in the state about the election results and even visited a ballot counting center in Georgia, the Washington Post has reported. In the weeks after the election, Trump advisors said they received claims that came from Meadows that the election was fraudulent. But when they checked the claims with outside experts paid by the Trump campaign, they could not substantiate them, according to people familiar with the requests. Meadows, a former member of Congress who became Trump's chief of staff in early 2020, was viewed inside the White House and the campaign as one of the biggest propagators of such claims. And friends, we're going to finish up with this one additional data point from the Washington Post article. And to this old prosecutor's mind, it's a really important data point that may shed some light on whether Mark Meadows will be a cooperating witness against Trump or will be a marquee defendant with Trump. Witnesses who have appeared in front of a Washington grand jury investigating January 6 say prosecutors appear to have an extensive collection of Meadows' text messages and emails, with one witness describing being shown a grid displaying the communications. Friends, one thing is clear. Mark Meadows is in it up to his neck. The fact that he was joking, knowing full well there weren't thousands and thousands of dead people who cast votes for Joe Biden, knowing full well that the Trump campaign had hired an outside organization to search for fraud, and it concluded there was no fraud, undermining the election's results. Knowing all that, knowing there was no fraud, Mark Meadows persisted in his baseless, in his fraudulent, in his false claims that there was significant election fraud. He continued to assist and enable a criminal president in that president's efforts to overturn the results of a presidential election, to thwart the will of the American voters. Mark Meadows is in it up to his neck. So really the only question that remains is, will Mark Meadows be a cooperating witness, or will he be a marquee defendant who is indicted together with Donald Trump in the January 6th indictment? Now, we know that Mark Meadows testified before the grand jury. That was reported back in June. What we don't know is what he said or if he said anything. Because he's in it up to his neck, he clearly has a Fifth Amendment privilege, a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. He could have walked into that grand jury and pled the Fifth 1,000 times. And that would have been a righteous, a viable, an appropriate invocation of the Fifth, because Mark Meadows, if he testified truthfully, he's going to incriminate himself of tons of crimes. So what we don't know is, when he went into the grand jury, what was his status? Was he a straight-up witness with no protection, no immunity agreement, no cooperation agreement? If so, he almost certainly would have pled the Fifth throughout. Now, there's no reporting on what he said in the grand jury, whether he pleaded the Fifth or testified substantively. We don't know. But if he went in as a straight up witness with no protection, his lawyer would have said, look, Mark, you're pleading the fifth from beginning to end. If he went in as a cooperating witness, then he would have testified fully and truthfully. What is a cooperating witness? Somebody who takes responsibility for their own crimes. They plead guilty, they enter into a written agreement, they agree to testify fully and truthfully about the crimes of others, and they get some benefit for striking that bargain with the prosecutors, either reduced charges, maybe a lesser sentence at the end of the day. But if Mark Meadows became a cooperating witness, then he would have testified fully and truthfully in the grand jury about the crimes of Donald Trump and others, because he would have had the protection of that cooperation agreement. The other way he could have testified without invoking the fifth is if he was granted immunity. I don't think that happened, because when you grant somebody immunity, you're giving them a pass for all of their crimes, because you're desperate to get the information out of them about the crimes of others. You know, you may grant immunity for a relatively low-level Trump lackey who might have a little bit of evidence to provide, incriminating information about Donald Trump, but whose criminal exposure is maybe very low. Maybe you immunize somebody like that. You don't immunize a chief of staff to that criminal president of the United States who enabled and assisted and perhaps conspired with that criminal president to try to kill our democracy, to try to overturn the results of a presidential election. I don't think that's the stuff Special Counsel Jack Smith is made of. Giving somebody that high up on the criminal food chain, Mark Meadows, chief of staff to the criminal president, giving that kind of a person immunity, I don't see it. But here's the one data point that I found really intriguing in that great Washington Post reporting. Other witnesses are going into the grand jury, and they are being shown what was described as a grid of Mark Meadows communications, text messages, emails. Can I tell you how this old prosecutor reads that fact? If Mark Meadows was a cooperating witness, fully on board, working day in and day out with the prosecutors so that he could provide all the truthful information and evidence he had about Donald Trump and others that could be used moving forward by the prosecutors, both in the grand jury and ultimately at trial, if Mark Meadows was a fully signed up cooperator, on board 100% with the prosecutors, there might not be a need to show lots of other witnesses who appear before the grand jury, a grand jury exhibit consisting of a grid of Mark Meadows communications. Why? Because Mark Meadows would have been the one to sit down with the prosecutors, go through his own communications and say, yes, this is what I said in this text message, this is who I was communicating with, this is what I meant when I used that cryptic language. Prosecutors would have grilled Mark Meadows, if he was cooperating, about every single communication, text message, email, DM, oral communications with people that aren't captured anywhere. And they would get all of that information from Mark Meadows if he was cooperating. There would be less need to show all of that to other witnesses in the grand jury and say, what do you think Mark Meadows meant here and here and here and here when he was using this sort of vague or cryptic or coded language? Now, none of this tells us conclusively that Mark Meadows is a cooperator, is not a cooperator, is an immunized witness, is not an immunized witness. But I have to say, I put this data point in the column that cuts against Mark Meadows being a fully signed up cooperating witness. They may be showing other people the Mark Meadows communications grid because some of those other witnesses are on that grid. In other words, they were on the other end of that Mark Meadows communication, whether it was a text or an email or a DM or a post or who knows what. But it tells me a little something. However, I hope Mark Meadows has perhaps learned the lessons of the past, like of Watergate, when I believe 48 people were convicted of crimes, most of whom did some time in prison. I sure hope Mark Meadows has seen the light and has decided to make right what he made so very wrong when he was assisting and enabling and perhaps conspiring with a criminal president of the United States to overturn a presidential election. Let's hope Mark Meadows has it in him to do the right thing. You know, Mark, better late than never. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.